All right, for our main topic this month, we are going to be doing a deep dive discussion into Metaphor ReFantazio, the new game from Studio Zero, the team previously behind Persona 3, 4, 5, who have now called Studio Zero. I think they were just called the Persona team in those days, but they have their new name to make their new game. And we talked a little bit about this game last month, Sean. It was very funny. I had thought we talked about it for like 5 minutes because we were trying to keep it short. And I said that to Thomas and he was like, you guys talked about it for like 40 minutes. And I was like, there's no way. And I went and checked the tape and we totally did. We did not mean to, but we talked about it so long because we love this game and this game is fascinating. And I think there is a lot to talk about. And if I could just start us off, Sean, the thing that I think makes it worth talking about more than anything now, and I know people don't like it when we bring real-world politics into things, but I'm sorry, there's no way to do that when you're talking, not to do that when you're talking about Metaphor ReFantazio. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, because these motherfuckers, they did it again, Jonathan.
Yeah,
they did it again. Because 8 years ago, I played Persona 5, got it October 2016 when it came out in Japan and imported. I just bought the digital version. It was playing it in Japanese. And, you know, over the course of me playing that game, we fucking elected Donald Trump. And I was like, what the fuck is going on in the world? And it just turned out that Persona 5, the themes and story of that game are very deeply tied into the same kinds of forces that end up electing a Donald Trump. And then 8 years later, they put out another game. And while I'm playing the fucking game, we elect Donald Trump again. And really, Metaphor ReFantazio, I think one of the things that's interesting about this game is that narratively it is a sister game to Persona 5. Like, it is interested in the same ideas that Persona 5 is. It's just tackling those ideas in a different way, which is not a thing they've done before. Like, I don't think that's the thing you can say about, like, Persona 3 or 4 or 5 within that series. No, those games have similar themes in certain places, but all three of those games have a very different central core idea they're tackling. I would say the core fundamental idea that Metaphor is tackling is the same one that Persona 5 is struggling with. Both games prominently feature an election as like the big dramatic event in the game, and they also came out in election years in America that when we elected Trump. So I love these games, Persona 5 and Metaphor, the two of my favorite games ever. But they can't, I'm sorry, you guys can't do it anymore. You can't make another game because every time you make a fucking game, or at the very least, you have to fucking make sure it doesn't come out of a goddamn election year, because it is kind of, you know, I'm not a superstitious person by nature, but it's making me question things that this happened twice.
Well, hopefully in 8 years, Donald Trump will be dead from just the basic forces of time and the actuarial table, and they will be free to make whatever game they want. Or they'll make another game and then Donald Trump Jr. becomes president. I don't fucking know. Here's the thing, Sean. So when did you finish this game? Was it before or after the election? I forget.
After.
Okay. Because I had been playing it before the election, but I hadn't actually gotten super far. I was maybe halfway through, but I'd been playing around with some other games, and I was really enjoying Metaphor. I just didn't have the kind of like overwhelming momentum you have on it, like when you get to the part of a game where it's like you're in a book that's page turning and you can do nothing else, right? I just wasn't at that point yet. And then the election happened, and I know I wasn't as far along as you, is my only point in this, because you were further than me. Like, I don't think I was at the point where they tried to, just spoilers from here on out, by the way, I wasn't at the point where they tried to assassinate Louis in the Opera House. And that was one of the first big things after the election that I played. And obviously the re-election of Donald Trump has been destabilizing. I did a little audio essay for the previous Purely Academic because I wanted something to acknowledge that, but you and I had already recorded, and I knew you wouldn't be able to get back on mic because it was the middle of the week and all this. So, you know, I'm trying to deal with my emotions, and I start playing Metaphor again, and that is when I fell into the, like, I can do nothing other than play Metaphor ReFantazio, and I finished it pretty quickly. And by pretty quickly, I mean I had 50 or 60 hours left, but I went through those 50 or 60 hours in fewer days than I had the first 40 hours. And I think it's because this game is, it's doing, I would say, like, Persona 5 is more specifically about like today's social issues when you're looking at what is it talking about. But Metaphor is doing this thing where it takes a step back and it looks at a bigger sort of philosophical and historical view of how we choose leaders, how we fall into tyrants, and what those societal forces are. And I think those are the questions I needed to be asking and exploring and thinking about after Trump 2. Persona 5 is really good about the questions that you're asking with Trump 1, right? Mm-hmm. But I think once we've done it a second time, we need to be looking to history and philosophy, and we need to be like rethinking what politics are at a basic level. And I think that is what Metaphor ReFantazio is encouraging. And I don't know about you, Sean, but I found this game incredibly clarifying and healing. And I came out of it with a sense of hope for the future. Not because it like assured me Trump is going to be okay. What it assured me is that it reminded me that these are issues that exist on such a vaster historical timetable than our puny little lives or this one fucking election where a bunch of weird shit happened. These are such bigger issues, and they require not, messing around the edges, getting a slightly better candidate, talking a little bit more about this poll-tested issue. It requires, and this is what the game is about, it requires imagining the better future and working from the ground up, from the grassroots, in ways that are hard and difficult and cannot effectuate change overnight. That is what a better world requires, and I think this game recentering my sense of what politics is as we head into these next 4 years, if this is the game of the year, that's why. I think I am incredibly grateful to what this game has given us, just in terms of clarifying my thoughts on this era in which we live.
Yeah, and I feel very similarly. So I was in the home stretch. I was in the last month of the game when the election happened. And actually, I kind of like put playing the game a little bit on pause for various reasons. One of them being just like the stress of the election and all that kind of stuff. I just felt like in that home stretch, I didn't want to sort of be distracted playing the game. And then after the election, I kind of came back to it and played through that whole final month that you have to sort of finish up quests and do the little dragon stuff and get all of your not social links finished and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously go and challenge the final dungeon that isn't the actual final dungeon that then turns into the final dungeon, and then you kill God. That's actually, it's a less literally God this time than it usually is, even if it's still broadly killing God with fighting Louis. And in that whole home stretch, like I actually like very much appreciate that I waited until after the election for doing that, because it had the same effect as what you're talking about. So it's like me processing the Donald Trump being elected again is kind of inextricably tied into the ending of Metaphor to me. And it had the same qualities that had it for you, of it being this kind of clarifying force of like, one, allowing me to give a space to like kind of step back and kind of look at things from that bigger picture scale, like understanding this, like this is that we are living in like the force of history, and that this is not like a, this is not the only thing that's happening, and this is not a sort of unprecedented event, and that like life continues, life must continue, and like you have to find like what is your path within that. And it also just being a thing that made me sort of stop and appreciate like things like art and stuff like that, and the role that has in your life, which is also a thing that Metaphor ReFantazio is very much about, and how like you can use that as a way to enrich yourself. And it helped me kind of like process that, all that stuff as well, in a way that's like very similar in many ways to, I believe in 2016, like all the Trump stuff happened right when I was getting into Shido's dungeon. Which is like where all that becomes the most kind of pertinent. So it is just this weird confluence of events. But it absolutely sort of gave me clarity into some of the things that Metaphor ReFantazio is about, that felt much more sort of weighty and pointed and apparent to me after the election than it did before the election in some ways. And there was like this sense of some things clicking into place in my brain that was like, oh, like this is what the game is doing. Like this is what the game is talking about. And it sort of made more sense in some ways after going through Trump being elected again. And you're like, right, okay, yes, I see where this game is coming from, and kind of part of what the message is exploring of the things you're talking about of the grassroots, like day in, day out work to try to not just make small changes, but the need to try to make grand changes and rethink things from the ground up, and to explore other political systems and things like that. Like that's all work that needs to be done, that hopefully like slowly we can move. I mean, this is all work that should have been done in some ways, was started being done after Trump was elected originally, but hopefully we can slowly push the American political system in this direction that can consider more radical reforms and changes. And I don't know, something like Metaphor just kind of helped me process and think about those elements.
Yeah. And, and this is all so inextricably tied in my emotions around the last month of politics and everything. But I was I think to some of my friends and family, I was a little confusing in this way. But after the Trump re-election, I had a couple days of being very shook by it. And then I became a little bit zen about it. Not zen in the sense of this is all okay. But I mean zen in the actual Buddhist sense of I'm looking at what's in front of me and I can accept what is reality. Like, okay, the world has been clarified. It's been clarified in a way that I don't like. But it's been clarified in a way where there are things I understand that I did not understand before. And I do think this game was part of it for me, and I think part of what Metaphor is doing, and this is not a subtle game. The Persona games are not subtle, this is not subtle. This game tells you what it's about over and over again, right? And it is, it starts with a fucking storybook and the idea of fantasy, and it is about the need to imagine. But I think that starts out in the game as a platitude, as it must. And it becomes a real idea over the course of the game, particularly in the second half, which is what I played after the election happened. And I think once you get into where the game, I think, brings these ideas into a real, meaningful valence where they feel very close to home and hard-hitting, and it is not using fantasy as an easy out, but as a vital lifeline. And the idea that when you are in a broken world, step one is accepting that it is broken, and step two is then figuring out how it would be better, and that is part of imagining, and it is part of fiction, and it is part of community, and it is part of friendship, and it is all these things. And I think that is one thing that playing this in tandem with trying to understand the election was, for me, I think one of the main problems that Democrats and critics and opponents of Trump had in the last 8 years since he came on the scene politically is our failure to do that big work of reimagining of not just there was so much defense of the system. The system must be defended from Trump, and not enough of, well, the system was fucked whether or not he came on the scene. Right? Because for him to come on the scene required the system to be fucked. And I think that is an idea that Metaphor really gets into, where the first half of the game is so much about touring this broken world and understanding the ways it is broken and the ways in which it cannot be countenanced. And once it cannot be countenanced, then you have to move into the space of imagination of what can be or what could be, and then you have to start figuring out what actions can be taken from that. And the game makes these metaphors, it's not a subtle game, but it's often a very complex game in the ways these metaphors become multivalent, because you literally are playing a main character who at a certain point you figure out is essentially astrally projecting into the world as a dream figure who is living the idea of fantasy in the world. And that is the kind of, stance that the game is encouraging in us. And so when I say I feel a little zen after the election, it's not because I like what is going to happen or I accept it lying down, but that I feel like I understand a little better how broken the world was, how we could come to this point, and what is required to dig out of it, which is not, nominating the next person in line in the Democratic Party and just trusting the system. It is the task of our lives is so much bigger than that. And, Metaphor, obviously, it's a Japanese video game. It was not written explicitly about the U.S. political system. Certainly that some of that plays into it, but not only. And it is helpful to look at works from other cultures that are thinking about bigger historical and philosophical trends to shake you out of, I think, the depression and the isolation of this moment and the fear it instills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things along this line that the game does, and this is where, the metaphor element comes in, is that sort of fantastic central premise, which is, let's take your classic fantasy world that is, your medieval European monarchy type society that is segregated based on race with elves and all that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously they're not literally elves. We have the Lusanto and all that kind of stuff. One little thing to mention here, I talked about on the last podcast, I did play the game in Japanese, so some of the proper nouns I might say in a way that sounds different And I looked over the English language Wikipedia page and have been shocked by the spelling of a lot of names and be like, oh, that's supposed to be that person. Okay. So, some of that stuff might be a little bit different for me. But anyways, it has this sort of generic feeling, sort of like fantasy setup you have seen in a billion things, sort of in that mold of Lord of the Rings. But then it sort of interrupts that world with, and what if we give you democracy, right? Like, what if, like, the king imposes using magic, whoever, like, gains, like, effectively the votes or, like, the belief of the largest number of people in the kingdom, they become the next king. And so it turns it into this sort of, like, elected democracy sort of setup that is foisted upon this world that has never seen or considered this before. And I love the way that it takes that, of where, it sort of helps sort of like defamiliarize democracy for you a little bit, to help you critically analyze the way in which liberal democracies are fundamentally broken. They are obviously fundamentally broken in the way that they operate right now in the world, because if they were not fundamentally broken, you wouldn't be having fascists being elected all over the place all the fucking time. And so it's like, here, we're going to give you democracy, but then immediately it's, okay, well, here's the two candidates. It's the one candidate, Forden, who is the head of the religious fucking, theocracy that is the real power behind the throne, that is controlling the whole kingdom. It's controlling what people think. It's controlling all that kind of stuff. And then you've got your populist fascist in Louis, who is not just like, I don't want to like call him a Trump analog, because I do not think he's a Trump analog. He's not like Shido in that way, where Shido
was a Trump analog. It's one of the interesting things that I think Metaphor makes it smart and makes it actually in some ways more applicable, because it's more distant, is that Louis is so different from being just a Trump analog. But we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we'll dive into Louis, because he's my favorite character, the most interesting character in the game. But you've got him, and he represents this sort of kind of fascist idea of revolution, right? Where like he presents the idea of revolution, but it is it is the kind of quote unquote revolution that a Trump supporter wants. It is not like this actual work of, we're going to clean up and actually like properly reform the political system to help people. It is, I want to be on top. This guy's going to tell me I get to be on top, so I'm going to elect him. Like that's he appeals to this sort of like core populist idea, which is the same kind of idea that Trump fundamentally appeals to in politicians like him. So you have those two, and those are the two people that it can be. And then you have this whole host of goobers, that are like these idiots. It's like, oh, I want to be elected because I'm the most beautiful person in the kingdom, and I want to be elected because I'm going to promote my company that makes the Gaicentia big tank things. And I want to be president/king because I'm going to make every day Friday, baby, woohoo, and we're going to get drunk, and right. And it's like, you look at this and it's a very like ridiculous setup. But then you stop and think about, well, that's exactly what our fucking elections are, right? Our elections are, here are the two people. It's the group that's in power. It's the group that tells you they're going to revolutionize things, but all they really want is power. And they're not going to help you. And then you've just got all these fucking idiots. You've got your RFKs of the world that are just absolute fucking morons. And they populate the rest of it. And so it's like, immediately it sort of just presents this idea of democracy, and then completely just like throws it away, because it's like, well, this is not what you think of when you think of democracy as a generic term, as a concept. The thing that we're like spoon-fed of, like, democracy is this sort of like unalloyed good, this fundamental thing that, that America's mission is to spread to every country in the world, and all that kind of like Cold War stuff that we've been fed our whole lives, and like the kind of detritus of that propaganda from the Cold War. And I want to make it clear that obviously I think democracies are better, is a better political system than monarchies and things like that. But I also think it's important to defamiliarize ourselves with the way that democracies have been operated in the world, and to consider that democracies can function in fundamentally different ways, and that we can approach it in a different direction. Because as soon as the king activates his royal magic, and it's like, here's the way the election works, the whole thing is rigged and broken from the fucking jump.
Yes, and I think, Sean, I feel like I need to jump into Louis right away now, because it's where my thoughts are going after what you were saying. And I think part of it is the thing that makes Louis different from being a Trump figure the way Shido was, and Shido obviously in the development of that game could not have literally been a reaction to Trump, but he's the kind of figure that, Trump is not unique. He's all over the world, and we see, populists and demagogues like this, and that's who Shido was. Shido was also like this rich businessman, all this stuff, right? The thing about Louis is that Louis is very similar to the protagonist of this game in a lot of ways. And so the game asks you to empathize with him in a lot of ways, in part because what the deal of his villainy even is, what the depth of it is a mystery for so much of the game. And so he's someone you have to lean into. And as you get deeper into the game, the thing is, Louis is correct about so much of what he says and what he sees. He has diagnosed the world correctly, and he has diagnosed it quicker than you have as the hero. Mm-hmm. He has seen what this world is, he has seen that it is shit, and he is correct in all of his diagnosis of what the class system is, how power is, abrogated in this world, how religion is used. He is correct in all of those things. His diagnosis is right. Now, his prognosis, what he wants to do about it, is wrong, and it is evil because it is based on what I want to do is make it similarly unjust, but with me on top. It's basically the promise of there's still going to be all this pain. We're still going to be hurting people, but we're going to hurt the right people. We're going to hurt the people I want to hurt, right? Is kind of the promise of Louis. But the fact that he is correct about the diagnosis and that he can get this far while all these other fucking idiots are kind of dancing around the sidelines, I think is part of exactly what you're saying, Sean, about the issue of democracy. And it is also something that I think has been humbling for me personally in the aftermath of this last election is realizing that, like, to some extent, I don't think Donald Trump is right about what he says, but the feeling he taps into in people of this thing is broken, this thing is rigged, this system is fucked, and we should just burn it down, that is tapping into something that is true and that is deeply felt among a lot of people. And when the system doesn't have an answer for it, or its answer is something like Forden, and it is, the religious hierarchy, that is when the system crumbles and is most open to being broken by a Louis-like figure. And that is one of the things that the heroes of this game have to grapple with as well, is accepting the ways that this dude who they hate and who has killed their families is also correct in what he has seen in this world. And I think in the way the game defamiliarizes democracy, it also, I think, makes you consider the villain, the enemy, the thing that is coming to crush democracy, the asteroid, in the Char's counterattack metaphor, in a different valence along those lines.
Yes, and I like you mentioned the Char's counterattack metaphor, because that's also what I was going to mention. Is one thing I think is interesting comparing Louis and Shido, is that Shido, voiced by Ikeda Shuichi, who is the voice actor who plays Char from the Gundam franchise, and in the boss fight they dress him up like Char, right? But Shido is not a Char-like character. Louis, if this was a Gundam franchise, he would be the Char guy. They just have to put a mask on him. And even then, he's got a metaphorical mask because he's wearing the fake horns. So he is wearing a mask. It's just a mask appropriate for that world, not a mask appropriate for the world of a Gundam series. And so obviously these guys are Gundam fans. I think that's kind of like a given for any creative in their age in Japan. That's also Guy. But also it's obvious based on that character from Persona 5 and what they did there with that like very kind of deep-threaded reference to Char. And here it feels like they decided, well, let's like make a character that's like Char, because Louis is so Char-esque, and his whole thing, at this core, it's very Char's counterattack. Like what he wants to do is basically bring the asteroid, right? He's going to reverse the magic and turn all the people into Ningen or humans or whatever, which just turns them into big monsters. And I want to go deeper to that concept in a second. But that's the equivalent of dropping the asteroid, right? He wants to wipe out society and civilization as it currently exists. Have only like the privileged few who are powerful enough and strong enough of heart and will to survive this process, and have those people be the one who build the world to come. And that's basically exactly what Char's plan was in Char's counterattack. The other thing that's so Louis-esque, so Char-esque about Louis, it's just all over the place with the character. But you have that thing with the horns where you learn that he has been lying his whole life, and he's to everybody, and he's wearing the horns. And then he has my favorite line, and fucking Nakamura Yuichi, who plays Louis, is just incredible in this game. I sung his praises last time as well. And it's just such a good character, such a good performance.
What, Sean, you and me on this podcast singing the praises of Mr. Nakamura Yuichi? When have we ever done that before?
Well, he has this moment that echoes, I think, our favorite Char moment ever, which is when in Zeta Gundam, Char is confronted with Haman Karn, who accuses him of betraying her, and he looks her straight in the fucking face and tells her, Haman, I have never betrayed anybody in my entire life. This is, of course, a guy, for people who don't know Gundam, this is a guy who, when we meet him, he has infiltrated this giant army because the heads of that army had killed his parents, and he's trying to find a way to assassinate them effectively. And from any reasonable person's standpoint, you would describe that as him being a traitor, and that being betrayal. He's the most traitorous motherfucker you've ever seen in your whole life. His entire life is a lie because all he's trying to do is get into people's good graces so he can betray and kill them. But in his framework, from his perspective, he's never betrayed anybody because he's never allowed himself to be on anybody's side. Louis has the exact same moment. When you confront him in the giant palace in the sky at the end of the game, before you go to the final dungeon area, he, like, you know, I think it's Stroll accuses him of, like, says, like, you're, like, liar, you've lied to everybody. And he looks Stroll in the face and says, I've never lied to anybody. Like, lying is the one thing that this Louis, like, does not allow. Is basically what he says. It's a clumsy, like, direct translation of the Japanese he says in that
No,
moment.
but I actually think it's important, Sean, that he uses the sentence structure in Japanese where he says, Kono Louis-sama is like the phrase. And he's like, this Lord Louis. And it wouldn't sound that, like, obvious to a Japanese person because this is a more normal construction. But I do think it's important that he names himself when he says these kinds of things because it's a way he both holds himself up and also holds himself to his own standards when he says these things. Like, the English translation is fine there, but I do wish they found some way to work that in, because I actually do think it's important to the way he talks and constructs sentences, and you hear it in the performance.
Yeah, exactly. But he straight-faced says this thing of that, like, there's nothing that this Louis despises more in the world than lies. And he's like, you're the biggest fucking liar. You've been lying to everybody the whole time through so many different stages. You've been lying to, like, people that he holds, like, close to himself, that he's never clearly ever really trusted anybody other than maybe Zorba. There's all these, like, folds to his plan that are so elaborate. And yet from his framework, he lies to nobody, because to him, it's not a true lie. Right. And like the truth is privilege for him and him alone. And there's something about that is so powerful a piece of characterization, because I think the thing that makes Louis so much more sort of complete as a character than Shido, because Shido from Persona 5 is one piece of a much larger puzzle. Louis is like the thing in this game. Is that there's a real appeal to what he's doing. Like, there's a real appeal and charisma to Louis. As you pull back the layers in the curtain of who this guy is and what he's trying to do, it's like, I think, like Char and Char's counterattack, there's something that you kind of are swayed a little bit to his side, because, like, his plan, and this, like, ties into the true central metaphor of, like, why is this game called Metaphor ReFantazio? It's this. His plan is to use magic in this world to turn these people into these monsters that are called humans. But the central metaphor of the game is that magic is a thing that is generated by, I do not know the word that they use in the English version. I'm going to use the word anxiety. It's the Japanese word fuon.
They use it in too. It's fuon is anxiety in the English. Yeah.
Which I think is the best word to choose. Fuon, the Japanese term, is like literally means unease. Fu is like a negating particle. On, it means like ease or comfort. But anxiety is probably the best word to use in English. And so you learn this whole elaborate thing of that, like, you know, this ancient civilization of humans that is our civilization, of course, like, came to ruin because of, like, the discovery of magic. And magic is this thing that is generated through your anxiety. And then either you are consumed by it and turn into these ningen or human monsters, or you overcome it, and through overcoming it in the action of overcoming that anxiety, that is where true magical, like, that's where true magic happens. This is where you kind of have a little bit of like a Nasuverse, like, magic / sorcery, or how you translate it.
Yes.
What anxiety generates is maryoku, or magical power, or basically like the magra, or magla, I guess is how they say it in English. That's that, like, the raw energy of it is generated by hearts that produce anxiety, but magical power and true actual magic, like maho, that word, that is created by an individual overcoming that anxiety. And it's only by being able to have someone who is able to accept that anxiety, move through it, and conquer it, and be able to move to the next stage. That is what true magic is, and that's obviously also the portal to, like, accessing the archetypes and all that kind of stuff that's in the game as well. But that's, to me, is like the central metaphor in the game, is that it all boils down to this concept of anxiety and the ways in which all the things in society and the way it's set up generate anxiety in the people that live in that society or within that culture. That anxiety is then sort of like pointed at the people above them who have the capacity, who have the power, who've built the structures that both create the anxiety but could also relieve that anxiety. And then that pools, and that is the thing that in many ways creates this sort of terrible cycle, because it's the thing that the populist, the Donald Trump figure, Louis in this game, Shido in Persona 5, whoever it is, that anxiety is the thing that is then exploited by people who do not have the sort of luxury of knowing better or having better options, choosing this leader that then is only going to make things worse, and that it makes the cycle worse. And that's what we saw in the Trump election, is that my personal opinion is that the primary reason why he got elected is just purely economic anxiety. And it doesn't matter that, like, well, if you know what's going on, you know that Trump is only going to worsen the economy. It's going to make things worse for these people. Their economic anxiety is going to become more severe. If that doesn't matter, these are people who don't have the luxury of being able to know all of that stuff. They're not spending all their time learning about the politics or reading the politics. They're dealing with their anxieties. But there is something that is so potent about Louis' plan of feeling like this just pure rage and anger at all these people so overwhelmed by their own anxieties and this, like, sense of discomfort and unease with their place in the world and all this stuff, and that piling up, and then using that to put this fucking evil motherfucker in place and allowing all this awful shit to happen that could be better. It could be better if we could overcome that anxiety, if we had clearer heads and clearer eyes that prevailed, because that anxiety is so easy to manipulate and so easy for someone like a Louis or Forden or any of these people to twist and use to maintain their power. And if you could just overcome it, it's so easy to see a better world on the other side. It's just a simply better world on the other side, and yet you cannot get there. And there's such a powerful rage that I feel about that Louis feels about that, and Louis' plan of being like, well, fuck him. Fuck them. Let it go back. Let all that anxiety, all the shit they've piled on, right? Because you learned that the power of the king's magic is built by the accumulation of all this anxiety that is all pointed up and goes up the ladder to the highest point in the power structure in the kingdom, which is the king, and it sits there, and either you're a good man like the king that they had, who is crushed under the weight of all of that, and whose entire life is destroyed, or you're an evil motherfucker like a Forden or in a Louis who wants to use that power, that anxiety, to do awful things in the world. But Louis' thing he wants to do is to turn it back on those people and have them be consumed by that anxiety and turned into horrible monsters and have the whole world just fucking burn, because fuck these people. They are the ones who made it this way. And that's one of those things about playing this game in the wake of the Donald Trump re-election, that, like, there's a part of me that if feels what Louis is saying. That's like, it happened once. We elected him once. We saw how fucking bad it got. We saw how everything got worse. How the fuck are people's memories so fucking short that you can do it again? How can you be so blind as to not see that it's only going to hurt you? And it's only going to make everything in your life work, because this is not a dude who cares about you. He only cares about his comfort and his power. And yet he got elected again. And that was like the moment of real clarity for me, was this, like, there are obviously lots of more complicated factors involved, but I do think there is something that if you boil it down to one central element, I think anxiety is a good one to pick. And there's something about Louis just saying, it's like, well, this is what your anxiety rots, like, then fuck you, like, let it all burn. Obviously, I don't think that's the thing we should actually do, but I think there is a legitimate appeal to it in the way that the game presents it.
And I'm glad you laid it out that way, Sean, because I've been thinking a lot as you're talking about the opposite of it, because I think the game is also very articulate about why that is wrong.
Yes.
I think it is very articulate about the problem is if you succumb to that, if you believe that it's all the anxiety and there's nothing we can do other than unleash it and let things burn, then you don't actually believe in a future. You don't believe in the possibility of human betterment. You don't believe in the possibility of the small connections that we make every day that can overcome these things. And I think one of the other central messages of the game is that as frustrating and horrible and broken as this world and its people can be, and Louis is very right when he says that, there's this moment near the end, and I had brought up the screenshot, but right now I'm using my phone to daisy chain because my internet went out, and we're recording this, so I don't have the screenshot up, but it's where Louis at the end, they're talking about all the like racism in this world, and that he's fueled it in different ways, and he says, you know, what are you blaming me for? These kinds of prejudices do not come from one person. They exist in the entire populace, and they need to be held to account for it. And when he says something like that, it's hard to argue with it, right? Because that is a pretty true statement. But I think what the game also is saying is that what Louis is saying is the easy thing. Louis is saying, given to your own anxiety about all of those anxieties, given to your own sense of hopelessness and your own sense of destruction, that is the easy path to walk. The harder path to walk is to say, I love and have faith in these people and their possibilities enough that I would try to work with them and guide them through it. It's almost Christ-like in a weird way when you say it that way, of like the kinds of like imagery that the game is tapping into with the main character and what you want to do. Because having that faith to believe that things could be better, that there are things worth saving, that the anxiety is something we should fight to overcome, you know, that's a real radical position. And I think the game is aware of how radical that is. And I think it's part of why the game is so invested in the idea of fantasy and of art, of reading books, and of, you know, consuming architecture, and that as you're wandering through the world on your the Land Runner and then later the Sky Runner that you have, that you constantly stop at places where you get off and you make a painting of these beautiful things you see in the world, because you have to step back from what can blind you about the mass decisions of the populace to see the other kinds of better worlds and worlds within our worlds that exist that are worth fighting for. And that is tough. And I think part of what the game goes through is also something that I think we've had to go through watching this latest Trump election, is that if everything you just said is true, Sean, then we also have to acknowledge the appeal of Trump, right? Yes. That we have to sit down and acknowledge that, yes, there is, and I think for people who rightly hate the motherfucker because he's a rapist and a cheat and and he's just the worst goddamn human being, that there is some appeal to, if you are in a two-party system and you feel the anxiety and you feel the system is broken and you feel it's not working for you or the people you know and you love, if you have two options and one of them is feeding into that rage and anxiety and is telling you things are broken, regardless of what he says he wants to do about it, he's at least acknowledging that pain. And the other person, the Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton in this equation, or just the Democratic Party writ large, is saying, but technically we brought inflation down, or the institutions are good and we should protect them, and blah, 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 and isn't doing the real work to like acknowledge that pain, which means you also have to give the solutions of like what we should do, of like the pain acknowledgement means saying, yes, our healthcare system is broken. Yes, we're doing, we give too much to the billionaire class. Yes, we blah, 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 the things that are kind of, that are not said in the party that opposes Trump. That when that happens, that is a way you lose faith to the asteroid, to the evil in the world. And I think Metaphor in its final act is also about the kind of wrenching job of meeting the public where they're at and accepting that anxiety as part of the coin toss that is the human condition. And that if you're going to lead people, you have to love all of it and you have to accept all of it and you have to work through it. And that is such a hard message to kind of internalize, because I think we want to pretend that we can ignore the worst impulses in us and just move us towards our better angels. But, you can't heal wounds without sunlight and disinfectant and without, acknowledging their existence. And I think that is part of what this game is doing too. And I hope I'm being coherent in saying all of this. This game brings it out of me, you know?
Well, and then one of the other things I think of, like, if we're looking at what is the game's counter to Louis, because I think obviously like there's a thing of where the thing that's tricky about politicians like Louis is like if the conditions are right for there to be this kind of anxiety, it's so easy to inflame and to manipulate with outright fabrications and lies, which is obviously what Trump does, right? He creates an entire illusory crisis by just telling people that it exists, and then that just inflames the anxiety and gives him more power, right?
And Louis does this too, because he creates humans and creates attacks that he goes and stops and all this stuff. That is actually pretty one-to-one to the demagoguery aspect of this.
Yes. And so part of, I think, the game's response is like, what do you do with this? And specifically, like, how do you sort of like shield yourself from these things? How do you become the kind of person who can process and move through the anxiety to get on that other side of it? And I do, as an English teacher, I do like that it's sort of like the central thing is, read some books. Like it's more generally, it's about engage with art. But it is very pointedly that like the main character is carrying this book that is obviously sort of like fusion of like Thomas More's Utopia and some of like Plato's writing with like Atlantis, which is a sort of fabricated utopian society that Plato creates. And obviously Plato's Republic as well is like all like on this idea of, we've had many, many writings in history of philosophers thinking what is the notion of like the best possible world, the best possible society, trying to imagine it and put it into writing. And then obviously you have whole kinds of stories that are explore that concept as well. But I like that its answer is like, read, travel, engage in art, meet people, become educated fundamentally. Like that's like the thing that incubates you against these kinds of attacks that can happen that try to manipulate you and control you. And like that kind of like deeper engagement with art in the world and understanding is like the thing that can allow you to move through that anxiety. And I do like that the game has, as is appropriate with this name, it's got so many different metaphors in them. One of them being the metaphor of the main character that you kind of alluded to earlier, the prince, who spends most of the game projecting himself into the world metaphorically in the way that one projects oneself into a piece of art, right? Like he projects himself in the world to explore and experience all these ranges of ideas and things that he could not experience normally, that were locked off to him, that were an impossibility because of the curse. And he brings all those ideas home back with him and becomes kind of whole and then prepared to be able to overcome this crisis that confronts him. That's just a clear metaphor for the action of any person experiencing art and writing literature, right? And then when I say, I don't want to limit it to just art, because I think nonfiction and like things that we don't think of as like always in the humanities fits into this as well. So it's like being educated in math and science and all these things fits into this, and history. It all fits together into this sort of armor you can wear, these experiences you get to explore that you could never explore if you're just trapped in your own head. And literature is the most direct way to do this, because you're just engaging directly with the thoughts of the person who wrote it, and you bring that home to yourself and improve yourself with that. And then that, of course, is then expanded in the other metaphor of where that is what you, the player, are also doing. When you are playing a game, you are literally controlling, you are projecting yourself onto this avatar in the game world, manipulating that avatar and using that to explore the world of the game very directly. And so that is like the other, right? You can look at it as a literature metaphor or art metaphor in general, but also very directly as a video game one, that the video games allow you to embody a different person, to control that person, to explore a different world. That's the world that does not exist for us. And then you bring that experience back into your real world and your real body and use that to hopefully improve yourself and inform yourself and enrich yourself, which of course then the game sort of lampshades as well, because you put in your own name. The king talks to you directly and thanks you directly for helping guide the prince and all this stuff that, it is a sort of two-handed job, is you and the prince together that solve the crisis at the end of the game. And all that stuff, I think, is a very kind of enriching message that is one of those sort of hopeful pieces for me, is that it sort of like reinforces this idea of like, that is a journey that's never done. That like, you're never at the part where it's like, well, I know enough and now I'm immune to these things. It's like, no, you have to be critically engaging with the world as it changes and as it evolves, and you never hit the limit of it. You have to keep on doing this, because even I think very, very smart and intelligent people can be manipulated and can be suckered into this little world. And we've seen this with many people with like the world of modern media, that then they get obsessed with and consumed by conspiracy theories and things like this that they should know better and they should be immune to, but they let their guard down. They let themselves be too easily suckered into these things. And so that's all stuff that this made me think about as well, is the way in which we engage with art, the world, history, science, that these are all things that are critical to being able to overcome that anxiety. And as one of the great struggles of democracy is creating a society in which the majority of the people are able to do that. Because that's just the reality, is that that's not the case. And that's how you can have people where it might be mind-boggling to you that someone could vote for Trump when it seems so obvious that every policy he has is just going to make their lives worse. Like people who have immigrated to this country, who he has said he wants to institute mass deportation policies, but then they get interviewed and they say, well, he's talking about the bad ones. It's like, well, in his eyes, you're one of the bad ones because you're not, in his eyes, you're not American. But, you know, these people can be suckered into this stuff. And so that and
I think it's important that the game is empathetic and loving in this.
Yes.
Like, it is not judgmental. And I think this is important because this is a tricky conversation I think we have in America as liberals, leftists, whatever you want to call it, is the issue of educational polarization that we have seen. That, you know, we have seen the party lines break more and more towards people who are higher educated are Democrats and people who are lower educated are Republicans. And I know as well as anyone else the impulse that exists to just go like, these dumb motherfuckers, why are they doing this? You know, why are they being so stupid? But I hate that feeling in myself because I know at the end of the day, it is a violence being perpetrated a lot on a lot of people that they aren't able to get and master this information, right? Not all of them. There are plenty of bad people out there who just don't, who have bad feelings and want to be angry at the world and want to be racist and homophobic and transphobic and whatever else. But I also think there's a lot of people who deserve a lot of empathy and love who, because of economic conditions, because of the conditions of just the entire way our society is set up, in terms of our economy and our healthcare and the way education is gatekept and the way, you know, literature and high art is gatekept by corporations and all these sorts of things, that it is a privilege to be able to educate yourself. And education is a wonderful thing that, you know, should be so much more universal than it actually is. And I think when you come to it from that kind of perspective, which I think is the perspective Metaphor ReFantazio has, yes, it is about what a wonder and a joy and a privilege it is to be able to, you know, lose yourself in literature and come out of that experience a better, fuller person who understands themselves, their heart, the world around them more than they did before. And that is something we should want for people, even people who have voted against what we think of as our interests. We should want that for them because making the better world requires that. And I think the game is very good about always doing this two-step of, what is the darker angel of your nature and what is the better angel of your nature, and why should you go for the latter over the former? And I think that's part of it. And I think, you know, just the very act of this game being the thing I turned to most in the days after the election to understand my own feelings in the world, the game is proving its own point in the very act of its existence and your interaction with it. And I don't know of a higher praise I can give a piece of art than that, but Metaphor is extremely self-actualizing in that way, just from the basic, you know, thesis it has being proven in the interaction between player and game.
Yeah, that was like the thing that I had that kind of like scales fall from my eyes moment. I mean, I love the game up till that moment at the ending where, in the ending where the election happened, and so my perspective on it sort of shifted. But it was exactly what you're talking about. This like, oh, like me playing the game, engaging with the game, and that instinct in me is sort of so evident of like the kind of message that Hashino and his team are trying to project into the world. And that I do think there is this really kind of positive energy, and there's this reassurance that it creates, this feeling of like sort of optimism of like, right, there are things that you can do, at least as the individual, to improve yourself and to cope with these things and to process these things. And Metaphor sort of operates on its own in that way, while the game also acknowledges the many structural reasons why that right now is not the case for so many people. I mean, as a high school teacher, I am more than aware of the many, many ways in which our public education system is not interested in educating people, right? So it's like when I say like educate yourself, it's not the same thing as going to school, right? And like getting a good education is not the same thing as just going to a school. The school should serve that function, and good teachers will try to serve that function the best they can. But the education system, America's primary goal isn't necessarily that. And so, you know, there's a very complicated relationship there between the educational system as it exists in the reality in our world, at least in America, and like the thing that educators are trying to do within that position in a very like flawed structure. And I think that that's evident in the game as well, because obviously it's like, you have all the ways in which Forden in the church is controlling information, controlling the things that people can have access to in this world. Obviously, there's the like just basic discrimination and racism and class differences that also make access to things like literature, and then also like the luxury of time to be able to engage with it. Because it's not just you have to read books, it's like you have to engage with them. You have to be like critically engaged with it, in the same way that the main character becomes so critically engaged in the book that he's reading, the Utopia book, that he is able to sort of see the other side of it, which is that the society that depicted in that book is not a utopia, that it is not perfect, that it has its own problems as well, and he sort of is able to overcome the limitations of Moore, his father, in the end, right? Like, society is built in such a way, our media and education and things like that in our world are built in such a way that it is actively trying to prevent people from being able to have the kinds of experiences that allow them to be immunized against these sort of tactics that manipulate their anxieties. Because it advantages Republicans the most, but it advantages Democrats as well, because, you know, it prevents there from being a more radical shift in power, which is the thing that actually needs to happen. Like, you know, the Democrats are the better of the two choices in front of us, but that doesn't mean that Democrats are an actually good choice in isolation, which is one of the things that becomes frustrating. And so, yeah, like these are all like, I think, kind of ideas that the game is exploring.
Well, and you know, I think Democrats in this cycle and in the last, 10 years of media have, like, I think this game has many lessons for them too in the idea of reading and going out in the world and engaging, because so much of this game isn't just the metaphor of the book and the reading. It is also that it is a game about travel. It is a game about going out and having difficult conversations and meeting people you think might be foes and turning them into friends. You know, this is a big friends become enemies JRPG, which is one of my favorite flavors of JRPG, but it's also like a political lesson. And I think there's been a lot of talk, and I think it is very true that the reticence of the Democratic Party to just go out and talk to voters where they are, to like adapt to modern media landscapes, to have difficult conversations. This is not me saying that like we all need to stay on Twitter with the Nazis and platform Elon Musk and all that bullshit. But I think the more real critique, the meaningful one of, why can't, figures like Kamala Harris go on, the kinds of podcasts that Donald Trump can go on and sound like a normal human being. Tim Walz could do it, but we muzzled him. And we kept him in the corner for the whole election. Why did we do that? Like those kinds of questions. And I think that fear of going out and engaging with and learning from the world, I think that is also a big thing that this game is saying. And I think it's something that also just helped, when I say I became Zen from clarity, this game helped clarify for me, right? That by the end of the game, you are a party of every oppressed group in this world, and some of the ones who have more privilege, all together having broken down these walls. This is a utopian ideal, but it's also a necessary ideal about coalition building. That's what it looks like, goddammit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's so much going on with this game that we could talk about. And I also want to get into later in this conversation the actual game mechanics side of it, because it is also important. But in terms of the story, I also want to press some critiques I've seen or critiques I myself have with the story. And there's kind of two in general. One I'll just say my piece on right away is that I've heard the critique from some leftists of they love it all the way up to the epilogue, where it seems like now the change is too incremental and blah, blah, blah. And I strongly disagree with that. I think the epilogue is one of the most responsible parts of this game. I really like that it does not end on the note of the prince becomes the king and everything is better. I like that it ends on the much lower key note of it's a year later, we're trying our best. Things don't become perfect overnight, but we're doing the work, and doing the work is the step to get there. I do think, something that annoys me in leftist circles sometimes is the desire to skip all the steps that are necessary for meaningful change and go towards if we just elected Bernie Sanders, we would have Medicare for all. One of my problems with the whole Sanders movement is there was never a theory of how you would actually get there. Like, you get him elected, okay, what do you do about all the members of Congress who don't want that? What do you do about the public that doesn't trust these ideas because they've been so inundated with, the insurance landscape we have now? Like, how do we do all these steps in between? I think it's actually very responsible that Metaphor ends on a note of, the work goes on, the election doesn't solve it, this is a lifelong thing, and nothing becomes perfect overnight. And I know that's a depressing, maybe, message for some people to hear, but I actually find that one of the most, uplifting themes in this game.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the epilogue is what it needs to be. It's about, okay, we have power now, and the reality is that, okay, well, shit, that means, you're the police chief now, basically. It's and you're going to be the general, and you're going to be the head of, the church or whatever, right? It's now we have won. We are the people in charge. You now have to become the people that run the day-to-day, nitty-gritty stuff. And the reality is that nobody's going to be able to make that, then just be oh, and then now it's all perfect, right? It is they're going, I think you just get this clear sense of they're going to make mistakes. Things are not going to be perfect. There's going to be lots of struggles to make things better. And in some places, they're probably going to replicate many of the same problems that they face that they were trying to overcome, because that's just the thing that has constantly happened throughout history. And they're trying to make that change. They're trying to use that power for good. And then it ends on this note of, and that means that they have to continue to go out into the world. They have to continue to do these things that we were saying. You have to continue to read. You have to continue to engage with things critically, that once you're at top and in power, it's not just about, and then we're done, we have the power, we do what we want with the power. It's about, okay, now we have to keep on doing all those things we did along the way to try to get us there. That part doesn't stop either. So they go back on the Gaisensha, they go back out into the world, they go traveling again. I really like the epilogue as well. I can see why it's not the most rabble-rousing, it doesn't have that narrative oomph to it that, other stories could have in its ending. But I think, as I say, you could call it responsible. It's just it's the nature of the honesty of the story. And I think there's something that's so earnest about Metaphor as a game and the story it's trying to tell, that it can't help but end in that way, because that's just the honest way for it to end its story.
Yes, absolutely. The thornier part of the conversation for me is about the overall political structure at the end of the game, because the other critique I've heard, leveled within that is that the game does still end with a monarchical system and not a complete upending of the system. And I don't know if I completely agree with that, because I think this also can fall into the trap that, again, I see sometimes in leftist thought of we just tear the whole thing down. But then, I want to know, well, what does day 2 look like? What does day 3 look like? What is the system that we build after that? Because that is so necessary for any theory of change. The critique that I don't know if it's a critique I have. I don't know if it's just a discomfort. I don't know if there's just too many metaphors layered on top. But for as much as the game is about big sweeping change, it is ultimately this big, weird, pseudo-magic election that ends with the Prince of the Dead King being inaugurated. And that is just the one thing I have not been able to kind of get over with the game. And this does not take away at all from my enjoyment of it or love of the game. But I did want to ask you, Sean, for your thoughts on it, of that, while it has a lot of these big ideas, it is also a story that does weirdly come back around to, it's a very roundabout way of it happening, but it is just the monarchical line continues from where it was at the beginning of the game, and things continue. And there's so many layers of metaphor wrapped up within that because of what the prince is and your role as the player and all this. But it's the one part of the game that didn't quite gel perfectly for me, because I can just feel it needling in my head a little bit. I hope that makes sense.
No, I totally get it. I've seen that criticism. It doesn't bother me, because it's sort of it's the same thing with Final Fantasy 16, where I think it can be a little bit hard, but you have to, for me, it's the game is not about monarchies. It doesn't give a shit about a monarchy. Like, nothing in the game is a commentary on monarchies in any way, shape, or form, because it is not interested in monarchies. The only reason it's interested in monarchies is because it's the standard political framework for these fantasy stories that it wants to use as its way of exploring the metaphor. But the whole setup of the monarchy entirely is, in my reading of the story, is purely metaphorical. So, right, like the main character, while we understand it because we understand at the time, right, we read it as like, oh, well, he was the prince the whole time. What is the reality is that he becomes the prince, right? He becomes the person who is then worthy to be the person to succeed power in this world. And the person who's worthy to seek power in the world, in a metaphorical sense, is the prince. He is the prince archetype, right? Like, that is like what he fundamentally represents. So it's like, to me, like, if you're taking it literally, it is, oh, well, it's just like the monarchy continues. But I think what it is saying is the person who has succeeded power is the person who needs to succeed power, is the right person to succeed power in the world of a monarchy. That is going to be the prince. And that's how these stories always are, right? Like it's, there's a, not to say that you should completely ignore the desire of monarchies and people, because I think it's a very sort of like easy political system to want, because if you have the right person in charge, that means they're in charge forever. And there is a legitimate appeal to monarchies, and obviously monarchies exist to a certain extent still in the world. But like, stories about like wayward princes that come home, that succeed power, to me, they're always operating basically on that same fundamental symbolic logic of, it is about, they are not the prince until they have gained the experiences and completed their narrative arc and become the person that they need to be to now be the prince. They are now the person worthy to succeed to the throne, to be able to hold the leashes of power in society. And that means that they're then the rightful person to succeed the throne. So for me, like, I just read it as it's so thickly, purely a symbolic or metaphorical layer that it doesn't really bother me, that it becomes a wayward prince archetype. In the end, to me, it sort of like makes sense with the overall way in which the story is told. Also because of the way in which it depicts the former king as a character, is that you are very specifically his successor, not just by bloodline, but by every other metric as well. He's your father, yes, but he's also the guy who wrote the book that you've been carrying with you that explores all these ideas that you have both consumed and also overcome and gone beyond by the end. So you have succeeded him in that sense, and you also succeed him in like the kind of gameplay sense with the archetype mechanic and all that stuff that Moore is in charge of, and you are able to create and build archetypes that he could not envision of, that is like beyond the realm of what he knew was possible by the end. And so in that way, you are also sort of like symbolically succeeding all the things that this king, who was a good king, who was an idealist, who couldn't bring things over a certain line and crumbled by the end, you are picking up those ideals and taking them to the place that they couldn't have been before, because you are both technically, literally, and also symbolically his successor.
I really, really like that explanation. And I think I thought that was basically what you were going to say. And I think that's where my thoughts land on it too. But I think it's worth like rehearsing the idea because it is so core to the game. What you were just saying about the whole archetype makes me think of The Lord of the Rings and the way like Aragorn is framed in that story, particularly in the books. If you've only seen the movies, this is a little different. But in the books, Aragorn has the right to go back to Gondor and be the king any fucking time he wants. He is the heir of Isildur. This is his line. That is his throne. The stewards of Gondor are there waiting for him. But he specifically waits for all these different moments to come. And in the book, after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, it's two things have to happen before he can enter the city and become the king. He has to show that he has the hands of healing in the houses of healing at that time, because the hands of the king are the hands of the healer. He has to be able to heal the sick and help people that way. So he has to have proved he can be a warrior, but also a healer. And then he has to be invited in by the people of the city, and he will not step in on his own. And so Tolkien is very much working from the same kind of logic that you're describing there, Sean, of, well, yes, technically this is like a monarchical system we're seeing, but the sort of archetype that Aragorn is fulfilling in the novel is this person who has to become whole in this very meaningful way before they have any kind of actual right to rule. And I think that is the same way I understand Metaphor, this video game. And also just that this is a game like obsessed with terms like archetype, and it has a lot of Freudian logic to it. And we know these motherfuckers love their tarot cards. And, the idea of the prince as an idea, not just a literal, the spawn of the current king, is so integral to, I think, their thinking in this game that I think you're correct. And the Final Fantasy 16 comparison, I think, is good too, because I think you do have to step back and just recognize, and Metaphor makes it easier because the game is literally called Metaphor,
yes,
to read it symbolically. It is encouraging you to read it symbolically, and I think those symbols are very powerful.
Yeah, and I think it's just like nobody making stories today are making stories that are seriously about the pitfalls of monarchies. Because what's the fucking point? We don't have that. Yeah, it's just like, and I think it's just it's an easy trap for some people to sort of fall into. And I just see that criticism all the time. It's just very dull to me. Not a metaphor, but just of like generally when we have fantasy stories, it's like, I don't know. It's just like, I don't see why you would look at it in that framework when these are fantasy stories. Like they're just not about dead political systems. Nobody's interested in that. They're about the world that even though they're not set in the world in which the person who wrote the story lives, it is about inevitably the world in which the person who wrote the story lived. Whether the game is titled Metaphor or not, it is still going to be metaphor by essence. I think it just can't help but be a metaphor.
And to me, I truly believe, like, in terms of all of these conversations, the two most important thematic gestures for me in the whole game are the moment when the protagonist realizes that book is not a utopia and starts writing his own book. I think that's the key of this game understands its ideas in a way that you as the player probably don't at the beginning. And there's depth that you don't expect to see. And then I also think the epilogue of the acknowledgement of, whether you like it or not, there is no such thing as Thanos snap, overnight change, new political system done. There is the final line of the game is fantasy lives on, at least in English is how they phrase it. And it's that is the like screen that it fades to black on. And it is the idea that, yes, it is the perpetuation of the belief in a better world and the working towards it. That is the actual utopia, because we will never live in a utopia. That's just an impossible thing. The word utopia, it engenders in us the sense of an impossible fantasy. The utopia is the existence in a state of perpetually moving towards it. This is also the thesis of the Francis Ford Coppola movie that came out this year, Megalopolis, which is messier in its ideas, but also very much in conversation with the kinds of things Metaphor ReFantazio is about, if you've seen that film.
Yes. And I'll just do a little comment there. The card at the end that says "Fantasy Lives On" in English, it says that in the Japanese version in English too, because the Japanese.
So that's just written in English in the Japanese. Okay.
It just says "Fantasy Lives On." I think it's probably the exact same image.
Yeah. So it's also fantasy is dead when you lose, which is one of the greatest fucking game over screens in RPG history. I love it.
It's like, fantasy's dead, motherfucker. It's the 70s. Realism's in vogue. No more fucking fantasy. It's like, gotta get into the realism, guys. Come on.
Absolutely. All right. And then, of course, there is the whole that this is a fucking JRPG, and this is the most JRPG that the Persona team has made so far, because this is a pretty hardcore fucking video game, Sean, with a big giant job/class system that is infinitely complex and permutable, and some big ass Shin Megami Tensei style dungeons, and some Etrian Odyssey style dungeons to the point where the town gets named Etria, which is fucking hilarious, and it's just also great and addictive to play. And I don't want to lose that from the conversation, because it is also very important how the ideas of the game are imparted, but also it's just fucking fun.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about the gameplay mechanics last time. I don't know because I was very far into the game when we last talked about it, because I was after they tried to assassinate Louis the first time. I was fairly past that. I think I was at the part where Layla, or God, what I just saw her name, was it Rila or something in English?
What character are you talking about?
The bird woman who's Juna's quote unquote older sister. What is she called in English? Because oh
my God, I'm forgetting.
It's
now.
Okay. In English on the Wikipedia is spelled Rella, and I was shocked to see that because her name is Layla.
They say Rella. Yeah,
it's Layla. That's a name. Layla's already a name. I have no idea why they made that character's name spelled like that and pronounced differently. But I was like at the stuff with that character when she gets power. Like that's where I was the last time we recorded. So I was very far into the game. So I don't have like a huge amount of additional thoughts. But just like I do think this game is tremendously fun to play as a JRPG. I love the class system and think it adds like a huge amount of depth compared to the Persona combat system, which is a combat system I also like a lot, but I think they kind of ran that well fairly dry. You know, like playing Persona 3 Reload kind of reinforced that to me, where it's like I enjoyed that game a lot. Obviously, it's a remake of an older game, and so it's not trying to do a huge amount of crazy new stuff with the combat, but it's like, you know, they made a lot of games with that combat system. And this, the way that you play around with the archetypes just gives you so many different potential strategies to employ. And we're at the end game and you have those sort of like the big dragon fights that you can do that are optional, but are very fun, or kind of like the hardest thing in the game. All of that is so much fun to look at your classes, look at all like the end game level abilities you have access to, some of which have some pretty huge effects. Like the end game of the Swordmaster line has the Neo stance. I'm not even going to try to guess what it's called in English. That's what it's called in Japanese, which is the one that reduces all damage you take by half, but you can't dodge moves anymore, which is like a huge ability that if you put on a character like Hirkenberg or Hulkenberg, whatever the fuck she's called, the Jaime Sauri character, like who is your knight type character, like that Neo pose on the knight archetype is like incredibly powerful. And there are just a huge range of different combinations of things you can do in the end game that are so rich and complex that sees all these different characters adopting so many different roles, getting all those abilities, and then you get your final archetype with them and bringing all that together to make like the ultimate version of that type of character. I found that experience in the end game very, very fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's by far the best, combat system that they have had in one of these games so far, if you go from the Persona 3, 4, 5 to this lineage. And I think the overall, I don't think the dungeons are anywhere near as good as Persona 5. Like, that is one thing I will say. I think Persona 5 has much more interesting dungeon design. I think there's some in Metaphor I do really like. I think the big one on the Etria Island, the Etrian Odyssey-inspired one, is by far the best one in this game. I do think there is a pacing problem that this game is missing at least one big dungeon. I think particularly the point where I felt it is with the character Rella or Layla or whatever we want to call her, but you have like a good 2-3 hour cutscene chunk there that goes through all that, and then you go fly off. Then this is when you get my favorite piece of music in the game, which is the new piece of music when your ship is flying now, and you go to meet her at the Magic Academy, and I was so primed for the Magic Academy dungeon because it felt like you were going there, and I've asked Thomas, my brother, about this, and he said he had the exact same feeling, that I think it feels very abrupt when you get there and it's a boss fight, because that is also Basilio you've just gotten, and that's the first fight you're able to use him in, and it feels like you should get to use him in a dungeon first. So I do feel like that point in the game is, if they do Metaphor the Royal, I think there will be a dungeon there. I feel like that is a big, gaping hole in the game that is a little weird. It doesn't kill the game or anything, but I just think it needs more right in that spot. Al, did you think the same? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I have the same feeling. Yes, that it feels like the Metaphor ReFantazio, the Symbolism Edition, will have, I think, a nice little dungeon there and just push the game back a month. Because, I do agree that it feels like a notable... and I strongly suspect that there probably was at some point in development. It feels like something got cut there. It's not like a huge issue, but yes, it does create like a little bit of a weird pacing hiccup as you transition into the end game, which is all the stuff in that last month with Louis. I agree. There's a little bit of a hitch there.
But anyway, yeah. So... But still, overall, love all the combat stuff. I think the final month that you have where they just give you a full 30 days is incredibly fun. I had so much fun. I finished the social links relatively early, then I can go to all the dragons. There's all sorts of grinding you can do. There's all these little extra quests. And just getting all of that done and getting everything kind of perfected for the final run was very fun. I did completely break the game by the time I was at the final bosses, because in that final dungeon you have that's in the second sky palace that's all the hell realm, realm that is the coolest looking place in this entire game. It looks like it's just a Hieronymus Bosch painting that you're playing a video game in, basically. But you can grind the shit out of that, and I got everyone's royal archetypes to max. I got the protagonist maxed out on every single type of archetype, so he had every move was in his arsenal. And so I had the big, I forget what they call it, but it's like the big Armageddon attack that some of the enemies can do against you can now do against them, which is 9,999 damage. And both of there's like Louis' final boss has, I think, 2 forms, and I beat them both in like 3 hits. And so I had completely broken the game by the end. But up until that point, it was very challenging, very fun. I will say, playing Dragon Quest III, the remake immediately after it, has once again, like, I still don't think the Persona games or Metaphor are quite perfect in what I kind of want out of an RPG in some of the areas. Like, I do think the archetype system is great. I think it's an improvement over the Persona system, and I think it's both complicated, but it is also pretty, what's the word? It's elegant, I think is a good way to put it. But I also go back to Dragon Quest, the most stripped down version of it, and I do find it more engaging. I do find, like, the basic character building and going through the world and some of the stuff it does. Like, I do think there's a richness in not throwing quite as much at you. And the other thing, and I don't know what the solution to this is Persona 5 and this game both have this thing, and it's better in Metaphor because of some of the ways they've moved it, but where once enemies are low enough level to you, you can just kill them on the overworld and do these like slashes and kind of run around. And I both like that and I don't like it. And I don't know how quite to say that. But I do think, like, there's a way it trivializes, and I think it's much worse in Persona 5. And I think they because Metaphor is harder overall and there's more ways to engage in combat, it's not as much of a problem. But the, like, trivialization of kind of the basic blocking and tackling of fighting that happens from that, I both enjoy the kind of grind of running around the dungeon and slashing things with a sword, and I also think it becomes menial in a way that I don't quite want out of a JRPG. So I don't have like a fully formed thesis on this, but there's some of that I think is still lingering in the overall design of these games that I'm not 100% sold on.
I think I kind of see where you're coming from. I overall like it quite a bit. Like, I like it more than the way that Persona 5 handles that stuff. I think their idea of, let's make this sort of hybrid system, which is like a very, very simple open field combat, which is just a dodge in a simple attack, that you're sort of like trash enemies, they throw just a bunch of like whatever enemies that would be the kind of enemies in a Persona game that before you over-leveled them, you'd end in a single turn because you just weakness, all out attack, done. You just do that 100 times. That kind of class of enemy, they've mostly just sort of like relegated to their fodder in the kind of open field combat and the turn-based combat, because that is more complicated and more time-consuming than it was in Persona. They have made that so, like, here are the enemies that are the stronger enemies that you then have to do the turn-based combat with, unless you have just really grinded the fuck out of it and really over-leveled. And I think, like, in general, I think they keep the balance of that really good, because I was doing everything in the game. I mean, I didn't completely max out like every archetype the main character has at the end, but I had a very powerful party. I had all of my main characters had the royal archetypes completely leveled up when I went to the last fight. So I didn't like completely bulldoze that fight, but it was not particularly difficult. But I feel like in a Persona game, I've typically kind of out-leveled the leveling curve at maybe the 5th or 6th dungeon, and the whole last, like, 4th of the game is just me basically steamrolling every single enemy. And for this one, I was not steamrolling enemies until the very, very end, when it gives you the, like, hey, if you want to grind, here's where you can grind to just get everything. All the Persona games have a spot like that. This game has a spot like that. So I was actually very impressed by the level of balance they achieved, because I think it's something very hard for JRPGs, that you do not become over-leveled, or you have to really go out of your way to really, really over-level if you want to break that system. And so I found myself enjoying the balance of the fodder enemies I'm just kind of cutting through, and then you have to try to engage with the turn-based combat with, and also figure out how to get into the turn-based combat in an advantageous way by using the open field combat for those harder enemies. And I really thought that balance was quite fun and was well achieved throughout like 95% of the game.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I do agree that, like, the level curve is way better than the Persona games, because I think, particularly in Persona 5 The Royal, which is like 99.9% a perfect video game, I think that point 1 is the level curve is off in that game, and you can, like, really break it pretty, like, past the midway point of that game. And no, I had the same experience, where I didn't break it until near the end. It's just, when I say I'm not 100% there, I'm like 95% there. It's like, there's a little bit of lingering, like, and I have this feeling with some other JRPGs too, like when some of the Square games that have come out, like Bravely Default, that let you like turn off random encounters or like maximize them, or all these things that like kind of trying to outsmart the JRPG around the corners. Sometimes I just like, but there is a real elegance to the simplicity of just having the fights and having the levels rise and all these sorts of things that I still do enjoy. But every game has its own purpose, and overall, I think Metaphor does it phenomenally well, considering it is still a very story-heavy game with significant social simulation aspects, not as significant as Persona, but they're there and they're big. And that you don't just, like, this is akin to Persona, the JRPG battle mechanics are not always the main thing you're interfacing with. You're also dealing with getting your social stats up and doing your social links and traveling around the world and making plans for that. So it's still a very multifaceted game. And I think like it's been easy to forgive some of the leveling problems in Persona because the Persona games are doing so many other things, right? And I do think it's impressive that Metaphor found that balance. And like I said, even if I'm not 100% sold on it, the fact that I'm like 95%, again, what this game is doing is ambitious and it's hard, and I think it's a really impressive like feat of level design and balancing.
Yeah, and I do think is just a tremendous amount of depth to the combat, in both in terms of how you build your archetypes, but then also just like the strategies in the fights themselves. Because I love that they include this thing that at first I was like, this is like a really game-breaking feature. I'm never going to use this, where you can rewind battles all the way to the beginning. But I think that's a great feature that I actually used fairly liberally in some of the fights, because it's like it helps you engage with the depth of the combat system, because you can see how dramatically small things can completely change the flow of battle. And using some tactics of things like, just don't do anything with this character. You can just pass the turn, and it like half uses the turn or whatever, right? You have like that kind of, each turn can be worth 2 turns. And so it's like, use up half the turn, move it to the next person. If I did that on this one turn and just had this person have an extra turn in the cycle, this whole battle becomes trivialized. And I was surprised by how frequently throughout the whole game I was continuing to discover strategies, some of them very simple conceptually, but because the game has so many different kinds of options, there are so many ways you can approach problems, that there are sometimes like very, very simple solutions to fights that I was really struggling with. So I do think there's like a tremendous elegance to the way the combat works, though it has obviously much more complexity than something like a Dragon Quest III. It does like boil down to like some like really key decisions that you can make as a player that are surprisingly deep or deceptively deep.
No, I totally agree with that. Here's one complaint I will launch, though. I like the restart the battles. The battles in this game desperately need some option to reload a save. Like, it's too much of a problem that if you're in a battle that restarting it, like if you want to get out of the battle to like change an archetype or your equipment or like something fundamentally was off, you either have to wait until you're dead and then you'll get the option screen, or quit the game and relaunch it, which isn't the longest like thing in the world. Although I will say I asked Thomas about this, and it's much worse on PC, I think, because of how games launch, and like everything on there is not as fast as on like the PS5 that we're playing on. And so I do wish there was some kind of, or just like, video games used to have this on like the Game Boy Advance and like systems I played in my youth, where you would do like a button combo, like LR start select, and it would just reload the game. I wish there was something like that in here. I wish that, and I've wished that in Persona as well. Like, I think a lot of JRPGs could use something that's just like, get me back to my loads faster. That's something like Western RPGs are better about, of like, give you your load screen faster. It is not, please do not take this as a game breaking, I hate this game kind of thing. It's a small annoyance that I would suggest a fix for.
Yeah, because it's only a problem in the boss fights, because in the regular fights in the world, you can just run away, and like it's very easy to escape. And in fact, you get with Barden, he has one of those things in his social link that allows you to just have 100% escape rate and you just get to leave. And it's like, so those fights, it's not a problem. But I agree, the boss fights, sometimes you're just in a situation where you realize, fuck, like I need this archetype on this person for my strategy, and I don't have it on that person right now. And so there should be a way for the boss fights specifically for you to, when you retry the fight, it should ask you, do you want to change your archetypes? Because that's the only thing I think you need to do. Like that's like the key thing I ran into in a couple of boss fights was, I'm just gonna have to quit out, reboot the game because I want to swap this archetype and this archetype with these two people, and then that's the way I want to approach the boss fight. And there's no easy way to do that.
Yeah, look, a lot of the game design of these folks comes from PS1, PS2 era. There's still a lot of PS2 floating around in metaphor.
Yes.
In good ways. But remember, the PS2 had a button just called reset, where you just hit it and it restarted the game. And we don't have that anymore. It is a harder process to restart your game now. So I do think these things could be built in better, but it's a small annoyance. So many things we could talk about this game. As I said before, I think I said this in the last segment from last month, that my favorite thing in the whole game was just the runners and building your trail that you're going to go on to do your journey, and figuring out how many nights am I going to be out there, and then figuring out okay, what am I going to spend my days doing in the city versus what am I waiting and hoarding up to do while I'm on my trip as I go out to a dungeon. I think that whole side of it is such a cool evolution of the Persona calendar day-by-day formula, and I think it's one of the coolest innovations in this whole game.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the whole road trip aspect. And you kind of mentioned earlier that last month is tremendously fun, and I agree. I really enjoyed sort of figure out, okay, here's the routes I'm going to go, and then I'm going to go here, and I'm going to teleport over here to talk to Yufa's older brother because he can change the weather because I want to go here, this, right? There's a lot of stuff like that you can do that is really fun. I also, speaking of the teleport thing, I do love that they build into the world the explanation for your teleport fast travel.
Yes.
And that scene, the first time you use it, I just cracked up so much of these people just magically teleporting back to the main capital and having their entire world just blown. It's like that scene in the Doctor Who episode, The Husbands of River Song, where Peter Capaldi Doctor has pretends like he's never seen the TARDIS before and shows this is what it should be. Oh my god, my entire framework of everything I've ever understood has completely been upended. And I just love that, of just these people being holy shit, what the fuck? You mean we could just be anywhere whenever we want? And they're going and testing. It's oh, can you just teleport anywhere in the world? And they're figure out the rules. I loved that. I wish more games did shit like that, where you make the fact that someone can just warp and be wherever they want that they've ever been before is the most incredible fucking magical power. And it's just games never do anything with it. And I love that they're just completely flabbergasted by it. And then every time you get a new party member, they have that thing as well. It's what the flying fuck? What do you mean you can just teleport your entire giant tank thing? What the fuck is this even going on?
Well, because the game wouldn't work without, because of the way it's laid out, that it has a lot of locations, but you need to go back to those locations frequently. It needs a teleport function. This is not a game that can function without fast travel. If you want to play Skyrim and never fast travel, you can do that. This is not that kind of game. So they're they have to work it into the story, and I love that they're well, how do we work it in? We lean in all the way. We lean into the skid, and it's great. Yes, love that. Also great, something we haven't got enough time to talk about, the Shoji Meguro soundtrack. I think in some ways it is not, it's not a soundtrack I'm going to listen to as much as the Persona soundtracks, in part because it does not have, songs the same way. It doesn't have a big anime soundtrack to it. I do kind of miss that there isn't, a big song over the end credits that builds on the themes we had before. But overall, it is such a bold and weird soundtrack. And so much of this game, I think, and I said this last month, is about defamiliarizing what we think of when we think of these kind of high fantasy JRPGs. And I think the music is the best at that, in that in some ways it sounds like the soundtrack you expect from this game, and then in other ways it's a monk chanting in a fake made-up language, and you're what the fuck is even going in Esperanto? And it's amazing. And I think some of the music goes so hard in such crazy funny ways. Nobody other than Shoji Meguro would have written this soundtrack.
Yes, I believe last time we talked about it, I mentioned that the night theme on Yufa's island, that theme is so good, where you have the female vocalist comes in, it's the and it's got this percussive quality to it. I fucking love that theme so much. It's so fucking hip. Like the music is, like there are some tracks obviously that feel a little bit more conventional fantasy JRPG, and then you just get hit something like that, and you're like, I have never heard a song that sounds like this ever in my whole goddamn life. And there are multiple songs in the soundtrack that are like that, and that's very cool, because that's not a frequent experience. It's not often that you play a game or watch a movie and you hear a song come on, and you're like, what the fuck is this song even doing? I've just never heard anything like this. I've never heard a Buddhist monk chanting in Esperanto, and like it's a Lotus Juice rap. That is like a brand new musical experience for me. And it's pretty cool that this game has multiple tracks that have that kind of quality to it.
Yes, I will say I like the night version of the theme on Yufa's Island. The one in the day that is like the vocalist going like just scatting in Esperanto all over the place gave me a little bit of a headache. Like that was one that was like, it was so intense and percussive. And I think there's one also in a later dungeon. I think it might be the first phase of the dungeon on the last day that was like so intense with like the rhythmic vocalizations that like it was like a little too much for me. But I also, when I say that, I love it. I love that it takes those swings. But I also want to highlight again, the song is called Wings of Freedom. That's the song that plays in the second half of the game when you have the Sky Rider or Sky Runner. That is like a top 10 Shoji Meguro track for me. The way like that one builds and the sense of like freedom it embodies at that specific turning point of the game. It reminds me a lot of the way the music changes in Persona 3 in the last month, and all of the beautiful stuff you get there around Memories of You. Like that is the Shoji Meguro touch right there. It's so good. Yeah,
and you gotta appreciate that you get an airship. It's a proper JRPG. No Persona game was a real JRPG, because no Persona game had you get a fucking airship, which is one of the rules as instituted by Dragon Quest. You got to get your airship eventually. You got to have a boat.
I guess that makes Nurus the Cid of this game.
Yes.
And he would be one of the better Cids if you consider him one of the Final Fantasy Cids, I think.
Yes, I do. Yeah. Yeah. It's good.
I was about to say, no Cid has been voiced by Kakshi from Naruto before, but I'm not confident in that. That could totally be possible. I should probably look that up before I make that statement.
I don't think there has, but I don't know 100% for sure.
That's my point. Yes. You can't say 100% without looking at his credits. But anyway, yeah. And, we could do, if we were doing the 16-hour version of this, we could go through every character and break it down. Although I will say, like, if you're comparing this to, like, Persona 3, 4, 5, I think the cast is great. I don't think they have, apart from certain characters and certain social links, quite the richness and vividness of some of the characters in Persona. But I think part of that is that Metaphor is not episodic and kind of anime structured that same way. It's much more novelistic, and I think it's much more about the overall kind of blend of things. So I don't think individual corners of the story and world stand out quite as much as in Persona, but I also think that's by design. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I mean, also all the social links are shorter than the social links were in Persona. They're like less emphasized. I mean, I do really like them. I really like Belgita, who is the Hikasayoko character that gives you the merchant line of archetypes, and she has her whole thing with the dog, and all that, and you kind of like helping her on that path of revenge. They do have that really great one with Alonso, where he seemingly
his is great.
Yeah, he's seemingly killed at the end, and then you get a letter. And I like that, like, you could just like not go fill that quest, and as far as fucking Alonso's dead. And I just like the idea of Alonso sitting in that bar forever, being like, is he just never going to show up? Like, I faked my death. It's a whole, like, I'm the faker guy. Like, that's my whole thing. It's me, Alonso. So it's like, I do think that they're not as sort of like fully rich as some of the Persona social links could be, but they are still very compelling and I think very memorable in their own rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Alonso one is one of the most fun things they've done with the structure of these things ever, because it is essentially a 9-episode social link where everyone else has 8. And so that is a fun way it does that. In terms of tugging at your heartstrings, the Akio Otsuka one is fucking great. Haizame. One I will say I did not like was the Katarina one. She's the bunny girl or whatever kind of, who gives you the baller archetype.
Eye character,
Yeah, I forget. Is that her name in Japanese also?
Katharina, yes.
Yeah, go say, yeah. So Katarina, I liked her story up to a point. that is the one that I will totally cop to. I think gets weirdly like neoliberal at the end,
Sure,
where
yes.
like she's basically a Robin Hood figure who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, and then is like guilted into feeling like you can't steal from the rich, and then starts a jobs program to educate all her people to get good work in the economy. No, I'm sorry. I do draw the line there. That is a weird, like, neoliberal shill storyline that I did not particularly like in this game.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. That's probably like probably my biggest criticism of the game is that one. Like, I can see where it's coming from, but like I think the problem is that like it just did like it's trying to present like this idea of, you know, a revolution or revolutionary tactics gone too far, and instead of trying to use destructive methods, you want to use positive methods. Like, you know, I'm not always going to agree with that. But I can respect that message if it's like done the right way. And there's just something of like, I didn't feel like her little band of misfits were doing something so awful that like it sort of warranted the direction they went in. So yeah, I agree that it just felt like off and a little bit almost like kind of preachy in that way of like just like, oh, you kids with your like communist ideas. It had that kind of quality to it that I wasn't a fan of.
Look, you never go into a Robin Hood story wanting it to end with Robin getting all the people in Sherwood Forest and saying, you know what? We were wrong to steal from Prince John. We need to learn how to have good jobs in the economy. It's just not what I want out of Robin Hood. And, you know, I wanted to go help Katarina steal from the rich, because the rich people in this game are pieces of fucking shit. And, you know, I want to stick it to them. What else do you have to say about Metaphor ReFantazio?
One thing I like, and I thought this was honestly like, you know, based on like the audience coming from the Persona games, I thought was a very bold choice. I like that it doesn't have any romance options in it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's like a thing that I'm sure the team was pretty pressured to include in certain ways, because it's a big part of like things that people like from the Persona games, and I like them in the Persona games, even if they have their like weird quirks to them, for sure, particularly Persona 5.
But like Thomas and I were joking about this. Can you imagine if in Metaphor you could romance everyone on the ship? Like with this character, it would have such a different valence. Because in Persona, you're some fucking kid. You're a teenager, right? Whatever. If you were like supposed to be the prince who was promised and you're double timing all these women on your ship, that would be such a different feeling. They really couldn't do it that way.
Yeah, and it's just not what the game is about. You know, there's obviously like a little bit of a sort of like implication with Yufa and Juna. There's like a little bit of a thing there. I love that they don't try to do anything with Hirkenberg. It's just like, no, she's this, you know, she's your knight. She's this big crazy elf lady who loves to eat and fuck shit up. And it's like, she's not like into the romance stuff. And there's no sort of intimation of that at all. And I just appreciate that it felt like the game was a lot cleaner by just saying, we're not going to do it at all. You know, I'm curious to see if they'll be able to resist the temptation in Metaphor ReFantazio of the symbolism to not put that in there, because that's a clear thing, a clear thing you could add in an updated version of the game. But I don't think the game needs it or would really benefit from it.
I think it depends on how you implement it. One thing I do think is I kind of wish they go so far with the Yufa implications. Like she literally gets in a later event, like the line that you get in all the Persona romance scenes of "we spent a long time together that night," like that kind of thing, that I would have been totally fine if when you went a year ahead into the future, like Yufa was your wife and queen and we just went on with it. Like it's I either feel like they needed to like do less of the implication or actually like steer into it and just say, no, this is the story we're telling. That is the canonical romance. I'm fine with that. And, you know, maybe in a sequel, they do some kind of thing where, or not the sequel, but like the, as you're calling it, Metaphor ReFantazio, the symbolism, I think if it was like a choice between Juna and Yufa, depending on things you do, you could do that. But I also think I agree overall, like as a gameplay thing, I think it's better without it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What else can we say about this wonderful, magnificent game? I think one thing I'll say, if people were going to ask the question, I don't know, I think I would still say Persona 5 is my favorite game this team has made, particularly the Royal. I wouldn't put this above that. I would definitely put it competitive with Persona 3, and I think it's better than Persona 4. I think Persona 5 is still, to me, overall the peak, especially in its Royal form, perfect thing they have made, and I would put this a notch below that, but I think it's competitive, like I said, with 3 and above 4.
I think I'd probably slot it similarly to that. Yeah, but I don't know if I would, Because part of the thing is like they're not like complete apples to apples comparisons because Metaphor is different enough. That it's not like comparing the Persona games to other Persona games. It's more like just comparing two different kinds of JRPGs. Like it's like trying to compare Dragon Quest with a Persona or something. A little bit more like that. But yeah, I think I would generally probably still put Persona 5 / Persona 5 the Royal above it. Put it more or less on par with something like Persona 3, but I definitely would put it above Persona 4.
Yes. Persona 4, we love you. You started all of this for us, but you are our least favorite Persona game, I'm sorry to say.
I like it more than Persona 1, and...
That's true.
The Persona 2s are very good. That's a hard comparison. Talk about hard games to compare. The Persona 2s and Persona 4 are very different JRPGs, so I'm not even going to make that.
Well, that's the thing. When I say the Persona games, people know I mean the ones people have played 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, Persona 4 is much better than Persona 1. I can say that with a lot of clarity.
Well, there you go. And we'll be doing our full Persona 4 retrospective next month. No, I'm just kidding. We're getting long enough that we could do I was going to say we could do our 10-year anniversary Persona 4 podcast, but we've actually blown past that.
Yes.
It would be like 11 or 12 years. Oh, God, we're old. Sean, let's move on to the next segment.
Let's go.
All right, Sean, that is another episode in the books. That's the first year of the podcast in the books. And by year, I mean 4 episodes. We've only done this 4 times. But I think Purely Academic is shaping up to be pretty good for the new year to come, 2025. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. I thought we got to talk a lot about metaphors. I got to talk a lot about Christmas, which I was very excited about. I got to read a poem. I don't get to read poems very much on podcasts, and that's a good time.
Yeah. This was a good one. This was a good episode. We're going to have more good episodes to come in the new year. Our January episode, I think, will be the top 10 games of 2024, because that's always our first episode in the new year on the weekly stuff. I think we'll continue that going. We'll also have the Doctor Who Christmas special to talk about. We'll have some other fun things. We'll have Christmas stories. I think it'll be a big one. I would not expect it the first week of January because we might have some going around. I know I'm traveling over the holiday, so we'll get it to you as fast as possible in January, but that'll be our big episode for the month, and I think it is going to be a blast.
I'm very, very excited for it. There have been a lot of great games, and I sure have been enjoying all these great games on my lovely PS5 Pro and my incredible LG B4 OLED TV that I really love and just think, man, it would be great if everyone had one of those.